Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
As we prepare for Hanukkah this weekend, we were thinking about the inspiration we still draw more than 2,000 years later from what was, historically speaking, a very short-lived military victory, that being the story of Hanukkah. And maybe it's because Hanukkah is actually a collection of evolving stories, each with its own hero, each with its own enduring lesson about strength in the face of adversity. The original story celebrates the might and the resolve of the Maccabees, whose military strength enables them to recapture the temple and ultimately win Judean independence, teaching us that we have the strength to stand up for what we believe, regardless of the odds. The second story, published in the Babylonian Talmud nearly 600 years later, after 3 failed rebellions against Rome rendered the idea of celebrating military strength kind of absurd, praises God for making a jar of oil designed for one day last 8, which teaches us that sometimes, even if the odds aren't in our favor, it's best to just wait and have faith. But there's another story of Hanukkah, one written just about 75 years after the first Hanukkah is celebrated, featuring another hero, Judith. And so I've asked Rabbi Laufer to join us to tell us a little bit of what Judith's story is and what type of strength she demonstrates and what can she teach us about strength for the here and now.
Beautiful. So any of our medieval art lovers will know you've seen the paintings of Judith and Holofernes, or Judith with Holofernes' head, right? It was actually a very popular trope of medieval art. So I'm going to do like the quick and dirty story of Judith, but you can go, I'm going to invite you, the Jewish Women's Archive online has a much more extensive version, so you should check that out if you want the whole story. But while the story was written about 75 years after it was sort of harkens backwards about a couple hundred years before the stories of the Maccabees, in a town also in the land of Judea. This time the bad guy starts with Nebuchadnezzar, who you might remember, not a fan of the Jewish people, king of the Babylonian Empire, and his general Holofernes, who is in Judea in order to conquer it and, much like the Hanukkah story, sort of conquer and rule over the Jews who live there. And so in this story, he's camping outside of a town in Judea, and he has basically blockaded the city, actually hearkening forward to the Romans, who also blockade Jerusalem. And the Jews have been fighting back, but it's not looking good for them, and they are ready to surrender. And then we have Judith, who is a widow, known to be wise and known to be beautiful, but not a woman of probably great power in society, knowing that society. And she says she has a plan. So under the cover of night, Judith and her handmaid, they sneak out of their town and into the camp of Holofernes. They pretend to surrender. And as the story goes, this general is so taken by her beauty and grace that he invites her into his tent, and she offers him, as any good maiden would, cheese and wine, lots of wine and salty cheese, so he drinks more and more wine, and he passes out. And when he is out cold, Judith takes his sword, which is the good part of the story, and chops off his head and brings it back to the Jews living in their town. And emboldened by Judith's bravery, they're ready to attack. And the army, discovering the headless body of their general, is in total disarray, allowing the Jews to mount their successful attack and defeat these forces. So what kind of strength, right? It opens the way for the Maccabees, or the Maccabee strength, right? That military might. But I want to suggest 2 things from feminist theory. This is a gift for you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
So one, I'm going to quote Simone de Beauvoir, who says, right, that man is sometimes able to transcend his biological materiality, right? We can see man outside of the body. But woman is entrenched in her physicality, and Beauvoir calls it a thing sunk deeply in its own immanence, right? That women are so centered in the body. And then the second, which I think is a really interesting piece, it's from a paper published in 1983, but I don't think it's changed since the time of Judith to now, that men's power derives from their structural advantages, right? Society was set up for them, is set up for them to succeed, and their access to external resources. Women's power derives from their domestic roles, but more importantly, from their relationship with others. Referent power is relationship-based. And I think we see that actually in the Judith story, right? She uses her feminine wiles, she uses her embodied self, and she uses the power of relationship to get what she wants. And we see that also actually in the Tamar story, which we read this week, a very troubling story. But Tamar also outwits Judah with her brains, but also with her body and her sexuality, so that she can get herself the safety and security after she's been abandoned by the people who are supposed to take care of her. And so I'm fascinated by this interplay between soft power and the hard power that we celebrate in the Maccabee story. And I want to note that Judith's tale, as I said, was a big part of Hanukkah in the Middle Ages. It's actually a big part of medieval culture, liked this story, and still celebrated actually in a lot of Sephardi and Mizrahi communities. We have Chag HaBanot on Rosh Chodesh Tevet, so in the middle of Hanukkah we celebrate it. And I'm curious, I know my historian friend, right? I brought the feminist theory, we have Rabbi Josh to bring the history. Why do you think our ancestors found the story so important in the Middle Ages in particular, and what role does it have to play in the way we define strength today?
Yeah, I think it may have to do with the way Jews saw power and powerlessness. And while the rabbis sort of brought a new story saying sometimes you just have to wait, and maybe Jews at that time felt powerless to reclaim their independence during the Roman period, it's not as if Jews were routinely targeted as a religious scapegoat during the Roman period, like they were during the Middle Ages. And so the Middle Ages were truly seemed like a powerless time, especially for our European ancestors, when the simple message of keeping faith offered by the story of oil that the rabbis brought really seemed insufficient. Jews needed to learn how to navigate a hostile environment without the benefit of any of the structural or military might they enjoyed during the Maccabean period. And who better to teach them how to navigate a precarious period without structural might than a heroine, because women have only been doing this for thousands of years. And so Judith taught them how. But I feel like you alluded to, we still have much to learn from Judith today, more than just simply how to claim power when society tells us that we're powerless. Judith can teach us about the very nature of power itself, where it comes from, yes, how we can claim it, yes, but also how it can be wielded thoughtfully and responsibly in order to achieve our goals and provide us with a different idea of what power can be. It doesn't have to be force, even though it can achieve forceful ends in order to deliver the Jewish people. While we're on the subject, do you have any last thoughts you want to share with us on the heroine of Hanukkah?
Yeah, first of all, I love that Hanukkah is actually these multiple overlapping stories, right, that give us, this sort of the might of the little over the big, and we have the theological miracle, and then the miracle of this powerless woman actually being the one, right, to save the day. And I want to just close with a quote. I read an article by a woman named Ora Damelin, and she grew up in an ultra-Orthodox community, and she said she was sort of blown away the first time she learned about Judith, and she said this, and I just love it. She said, "And yet still there was Judith. Judith who takes no orders, who invades a man's tent and walks out with his head on her pike. Judith who attacks alone, but who is neither punished nor silenced. Judith who alters the destiny of her people, my people, independently of her generation's male heroes. Judith who does the work of the God of open miracles, the God who splits the sea, and the God who does not merely influence, but acts." And so that's part of what we're supposed to celebrate on Hanukkah, right, is that theological miracle, but the theological miracle wrought through humanity, right? It's not until the rabbis that we add God into the Hanukkah story, and instead it's actually supposed to be the story of what we, and I think reading Judith with the Maccabees says we, right? Regardless of your physical body, what we can do to bring about, whether it is redemption or rededication, which is certainly the miracle of Hanukkah. And I think Judith helps us do that.
I think you're right, and I think she teaches us in this almost age of superhero literature that really there's a hero inside of all of us.
Amen.
So Shabbat Shalom, thank you for joining us for this
And Chag
conversation.
Sameach.
And
Almost.
Chag Sameach.